Hi, this is Kowski for AP Gov Review, and in our final installment on the executive branch, we're going to be looking at how the power of the presidency has grown quite significantly over the past century. So as we discussed in prior videos, some of the informal powers, remember when we're talking about informal powers, we're talking about those not enumerated or directly specified in the Constitution, but something that the president has assumed as a role from morale builder to party leader, world leader, budget setter, etc. These are things that have increased gradually the power of the presidency. Now, a book known as the Imperial Presidency, written by an author named Arthur Schlesinger in the 1970s, basically wrote that the president's power was growing beyond what the founding fathers wanted. And when we talk about an imperial power, we're talking about sort of like a monarchical type of role that the president has taken. So over the past, few presidencies, looking back, would George Bush classify as an imperial president? Has Barack Obama trended that way? Is it necessarily even bad to have an imperial president? That really is going to come down really to one's own ideological viewpoint as to what powers one believes is constitutionally given to the president. And a lot of this sometimes comes down to interpretations. So some of the factors that have, led to the increase in power of the presidency. Well, first one, war powers, right? There's been that constitutional conflict between Congress and the president to declare war. Interestingly enough, the last time Congress officially declared war was World War II. Every other military conflict was just simply a conflict in which the president sent in troops. And that is a power given to the president thanks to the role of commander-in-chief. Now, since the president technically cannot declare war him or herself, they have to consult Congress, but that still really hasn't happened. Yet, in this very rapidly changing world, very fast-paced, things happen at a moment's notice, would the president even have time to consult Congress, or is that just a fruitless argument? So presidents have sent in troops over 125 times. Think about that, 125 times without congressional declaration of war. So you really see that commander-in-chief power really, in some ways dominating over Congress's role to declare war. Some, again, are going to say that's a good thing. Some are going to say that's a bad thing. But remember, with AP Gov, you are not asked to give your opinion. This is a political theory class, so never inject your opinion on an FRQ. And certainly that's, another time, another place to do that, but definitely not on the AP Gov exam. They don't want to know your opinion. Now, also in terms of how the president has increased his or her power has been through the veto. Just the mere threat of a veto can influence changes in legislation. Sometimes it will even prevent a bill from getting passed in one of the houses. Just because of the difficulty of overriding the president, right? You need 2/3 of the houses in Congress to do so. And just the fact that 93% of vetoes are sustained says a lot, right? You're talking about one person vetoing it over 535 members of Congress, assuming that they all wanted that bill to pass. But again, you're saying one person is being a roadblock. And should that be indicative of a democratic republic? Again, many opinions on this aisle. But if you look at really the number of vetoes, you see some presidents, such as FDR, much higher than others. Some not as much. But also, if you just look at the number of times Congress overrode their veto, in some cases 0, or just a mere 1. So again, is this imperial? Is FDR an imperial president for the number of vetoes he used? Now, some of the other factors that have strengthened the presidency, a concept known as executive privilege. This is private communication between the president and his or her principal advisors. This is nowhere found in the Constitution. It's just supported by tradition. But the idea of executive privilege is that the president needs to feel free to communicate without having to watch what he or she is saying. Some of the support for how this might be deemed constitutional is that the separation of powers prevents one branch from meddling or inquiring into internal workings of another branch. So Congress, according to executive privilege, should not be able to see what that privileged communication is. Again, sort of you're going to be more assured of your private discussion, especially when it's relating to more delicate issues, maybe whether it's national security or whatever the issue may be, that you need to have some type of privileged communication. So what's interesting is that Congress actually never questioned executive privilege until the Watergate scandal, in a very big landmark decision case in U.S. v. Nixon. It basically came down to that there is no absolute privilege of immunity. So as a result, Nixon was trying to have the privileged communication suppressed, and this was ultimately deemed unconstitutional. And as a result, this is a significant case that is going to limit presidential expansion. And this was very instrumental in the Watergate scandal. So it's a check. This was a major check on the president. But nevertheless, the fact that executive privilege still exists today is indicative of an imperial presidency. So the idea of executive privilege, right? You have, people behind here, and then this is my invincibility cloak. The idea that, again, you can have this privileged communication and that Congress should not be allowed to meddle into the president's affairs. Perhaps the biggest factor in the imperial presidency is the executive order. A president can issue an executive order which basically has the force of law relating to the Constitution, treaties, or other legislative statutes. The president, in this case, when issuing an executive order, is not creating a new law. It's already a rule or a law that's on the book, but you're also sort of making it enforced in a more selective way. It can also create or modify rules for existing executive administrative offices and agencies, such as the EPA. So how to enforce one restriction or regulation of the EPA on the environment, that would certainly come down to an executive order should the president wish to do so. The only restriction on executive orders is that they can be or that they must be published in the Federal Register. If you ever want to waste some time or you ever want to go to sleep, that's the daily publication of the U.S. government, and that can certainly be burdensome to read. Now, executive orders are typically not overturned. Presidents are not going to issue them if they anticipate a veto-proof majority against them. They can be actually overturned if they are unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Now, another restriction that has come about is what's known as impoundment. Prior to Richard Nixon as his president, it was the presidential practice of refusing to spend money appropriated by Congress, and this was practiced by President Nixon. Ultimately, the Budget Reform and Impoundment Act of 1974 says you cannot refuse to spend money that's been allocated by Congress because Congress has the power of the purse. It is the one that approves the budget. So a president cannot impound these funds. And when we're talking about impounding, think about a car being impounded, right? You can't use that car. Well, if the president doesn't agree with funding for something, let's say an agency, then the president can't just say, hey, we're not going to spend this money on, let's say, the EPA. So as a result, this is going to restrict some of the power of the presidency in terms of impoundment. Now, certainly there are many concerns over the president having too much power. You can easily argue that the presidency is the most powerful branch of the three. Others say that there are too many checks and balances on the president, but that argument really is not totally dominant today. But again, if you just look at executive privilege, executive agreements, those are two of the main factors that have really driven the increase in power of the presidency. And again, some say this is the result of presidents have increased the functions of government with more responsibilities. So in summary, Americans expect a lot from their presidents. They expect him to be the chief legislator. They expect him or her to be the chief economist, charge of the military. So there's a lot of different working parts here. And for a president to act efficiently, one could argue that a president needs to have all these powers. Again, it can really be difficult depending on one's ideological viewpoint. Certainly, they are part of the broader organization of government. They need to work with the leadership of Congress. That can be very difficult, especially when there's a lot of partisanship. But again, when at the end of the day, there are many roles, responsibilities, even national security, as we've talked about, and this can be difficult sometimes to adhere to the Madisonian system of checks and balances as discussed in Unit 1. All right, let's end with a review question. In U.S. v. Nixon, the U.S. Supreme Court, take a moment to read through them. And if you said E, ruled that the president does not have an absolute executive privilege, you are correct.